The world is becoming increasingly proficient at telling stories that deny God. As such, we need Thinking Christian to become as natural as breathing. Welcome to the Thinking Christian podcast. I'm Dr. James Spencer. Through calm, thoughtful, theological discussions, Thinking Christian highlights the ways God is working in the world and questions the underlying social, cultural, and political assumptions that hinder Christians from becoming more like Christ. Now, on to today's episode of Thinking Christian. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. I'm Dr. James Spencer, and I'm joined today by Dr. Felicia Song. She is a sociologist, an author, and a speaker, and she's written a book with IVP Press, or InterVarsity Press, I guess, called Restless Devices. And so we're going to be having a conversation around technology and what it means to be a person and how digital technology really influences us today. And so just welcome, Dr. Song. Really appreciate you being here. And just thanks for writing the book. I found it fascinating. This is an area and a topic that we've addressed on the podcast a number of different times. And so I was excited to hear from somebody with your academic background talk about these issues. So yeah, just thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. I'm really glad to be here.
Tell a little bit about, I was reading on your website that you were in Boston and you ran across Marshall McLuhan. So can you tell a little bit about how you got started on this journey toward thinking about media studies and sociology and those kind of things?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was right out of college, and I was floating around in the used bookstores of Boston. Um, I came across a small book by Marshall McLuhan that was called "The Medium is the Massage," which is a little different from what anyone who usually knows anything about McLuhan is familiar with. Most people who have familiarity with this literary theorist know his phrase, the medium is the message,
Yeah.
right? This idea that with any communication technology, um, its formative powers is not so much the programming, the content, the news that you're hearing or the TV show that you're watching, right? But it's actually the medium, the form of the technology, the audio, the visual, the way that they're fast cuts, sound bites, and so forth. That's what's really forming us, right? And so, anyway, I came across this book and um, I was just amazed that anyone, I mean, these were some thoughts I was starting to have on my own, just thinking about um, the effect of media on our lives. And so this was even
Yeah.
like pre-internet,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was in sort of like mid 90s.
Okay.
I had my email account for maybe all of 1 year, right?
First, you're still on
Pre-MySpace.
dial-up and
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. And so I was kind of more fascinated in this idea that there's something about the form, the
Mhm.
design of a technology that shapes us in ways that it's more powerful even than the content. Because I was familiar with the kind of critiques and concerns of what media does to us, right? But it was the form of it that kind of got me thinking, and I was super excited that there's this theorist that was, once I actually started reading McLuhan, I was like, oh man, he's like impenetrable. Like he's really hard to read. If anyone has read him, you know what I'm talking about. It's
Right.
kind of a mind job, just like following his argument. But I then came across Neil Postman,
Yeah.
Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is very readable, very
Hmm.
accessible. And again, making the same kind of argument, framing, getting us to think about how the way that our media actually trains us
Yeah.
to emphasize or prioritize certain kinds of information, right? Visual information or
Hmm.
audio information. Um, or, when you go back through history, the different kinds of technologies you think about the innovation of the printing press, the
Right.
innovation of writing, right? How each of these innovations shifted, right? How we communicated, how we moved information around, right?
Yeah.
And so this whole idea that these technologies develop, become dominant in a culture and then completely shift how we perceive reality was so very interesting to me. There's sort of side stories on how I watched this was, if any of your audience remembers back in the day, this was back when U2 was doing a concert. Um, Series that involved Bono with a camera he would hold it to himself, right?
Yeah,
And this
yeah.
is the onset of the big screens at the big stadium concerts, and he was
Right,
singing better than the real thing. And he has the camera on himself, and he's spinning around and he's singing it. And it's just this whole ironic critique, right, of how nobody's actually watching Bono when they're at the
right.
concert. They're not watching Bono himself with the camera. They're looking at the screen now, right? And this whole idea that we're enthralled by
Yeah,
the thing on the screen over and above this incredible celebrity superstar like who's right in front of you, right? You're not
right.
even watching him anymore because you
Yeah.
just can't stop watching the screen.
Yeah, it's sort of fascinating to think through. I remember that. I would have
Oh, you
been
do? Okay.
in high school in the mid 90s. And
Yeah.
so I remember Bono doing that. And, you know, sort of, I think the cultural critique was sort of lost on me at that point. Right. But, but I will say now, when we go to, my wife and I have gone to concerts or we'll go to, a hockey game or something like that. And it's not without effort that you ignore those jumbotrons or
Totally.
the big screens. And I mean, at the concerts, it's in some ways even worse because they construct this whole thing so that people in the back can actually see the singer, right? But
Yes.
they've got so much going on behind him.
Right.
You're
Totally.
just like, what am I supposed to look at?
Yeah.
This feels like more than just a backdrop, and
Yeah.
it does just underscore that point of that
Yeah.
that these forms really do. Uh, pull our attention in certain ways, that they actually do have some level of influence over how we perceive what's going
Mm-hmm.
on and what we look at. It's
Mm-hmm.
fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and I love your point about modern day concerts is the ways that the performers have evolved.
Yeah,
They've created concerts for the Jumbotron,
right.
right? And so that gets at the ways in which it doesn't own the technology shifting doesn't only affect us as the consumers, but it affects the producer, right? The creator, the content creator. They are
Yeah,
thinking in terms of the medium, right? And thinking wholly about how it's going to be expressed, right? Through the
yeah,
screen, through the jumbotron, whatever it is. And that changes up, right? What they're going to do, how they're going to perform, right?
yeah,
And again, there's reams and reams of incredible scholarship about especially political communication, right? How politicians have changed, right? Not only their look, because of television, but also what they say, right,
yeah.
in debates and so forth, because of the medium.
Yeah, which is you sort of have to wonder. Some of that's got to be for the good and for the bad, But I guess I've read McLuhan. I
Yeah.
understand, I think, sort of what he's saying. Right. You're right. Neil Postman, far more accessible. Um, even when I read, Jacques Ellul is for me
Oh,
like
yeah.
sort of the theological McLuhan, and you're just going, I don't understand half of what
No,
he's saying,
yeah.
but I think I agree.
Right.
Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
and so, but
Totally.
Neil Postman's so much more accessible. Um, but I guess I'm wondering with McLuhan, what does he attribute the power of the medium to? Like, are there aspects of this where he would say, like, let's say, certain medium are given to different sort of selection biases than
Mhm.
others? Is that a component, or does he attribute it to anything, or does he just sort of assert it and argue it?
Yeah. I mean, I think his focus is mainly on how particular media, what he calls extends the senses, right?
Yeah,
And so as human beings, we have these different sensory capacities to access our reality.
hmm,
And what the technology does is it extends, right, the visual or the audio or the cognitive over the tactile, right?
Yeah.
And so I think he has a much more, it's kind of a phenomenological approach,
Okay.
or kind of existential understanding of the human being as just kind of like perceiving, right, the world in
Yeah.
particular ways, and how these technologies then are they mediate us, right? That they're the go between
Yeah.
us and what's actually happening. So I think he was always fascinated by what he saw as fundamental shifts in how we are human, right?
Okay.
Like, so
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
can't, with all the evolutions of the various communication technologies, like we can't sit down and recite the Iliad, right?
Right.
Right. Like we don't have bards showing up and just like reciting 60-page poems, right?
Right.
That
Right.
explain the history of our civilization. Like we don't have the memory, right? Like we don't have that
Yeah.
facility to hold all that information because we don't
Right.
need to. We haven't trained in that.
Right.
And we also don't have the capacity as receivers of that to hold all of it, right? Like we need something else. We can't just like listen to someone, even though I guess we listen to podcasts and audiobooks now. So
Yeah.
that might
Yeah.
be an interesting connection.
We're starting to shift back a little bit more to that
Yeah.
that sort of auditory or
Mhm.
audible learning, I guess we call it.
Mhm.
When you look at some of this, and I guess sort of shifting away from McLuhan, but when you think about the bards, like you mentioned, coming into town and they're sort of the center of attention, and you have really this, it's almost like you just have the one input, right? Or maybe you have, let's say you have five inputs, right? I mean, I
Sure.
think back to, studying the Puritans, and Jonathan Edwards could give a, an hour and a half long sermon because he's the only game in town. This is the only
Right.
thing people are listening to most of the week. And so it's like, yeah, we'll do it for an hour and a half. That's no problem. This is great, right? It's like watching an action movie,
Mhm.
except it's not, it's a sermon. And so, there's a sense in which you've got this sort of the different inputs, the frequency of those inputs, the depth of those inputs, and the way that those inputs then are conveyed, versus today where we have what is practically infinite number of inputs for information, and we can get that at all times in the simplest way possible. How does that factor into something like a media ecology approach, where the intensity of it, the ubiquity of it is so amped up at this point? And how do you counsel people to sort of, I guess this is like eight questions in a row, but um, but how do you counsel people to say, look, it's an all-you-can-eat buffet, so just don't go up there with three plates and try to, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, no, that's the a gazillion dollar question of our age, right?
right.
Um, and I mean, I think that's what makes, I think, living in this time uniquely challenging.
Yeah.
Like you said, in the ages of the Bard, um, there there was no choice. You didn't have to decide. It was just one game in town. Great. I'm just gonna go. This is my
Right.
entertainment for the week, right?
Right.
And I'm gonna go bring my dinner and listen or whatever. Um, and and now we don't have those institutional, um, societal boundaries. Um, I'm thinking about, right, so um, sociologists think about society not just as groups of people, but as
Right.
structures and institutions, right?
Yeah.
And so prior to all that we have today, in terms of technology, it's just you got information, like you said, through particular institutions, and they
Yeah.
were limited, and they were bounded in particular through particular um, in their own industry. There was there was the premier, news up here, and then there was the local, and then there was the rags, right?
Right.
The kind of gossipy stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there was this hierarchy, and then you had to go to the store to get it, or it had to be delivered, all this stuff. And now, right, those are all like institutional structural boundaries
Yeah.
that exist that we don't have anymore, right?
Yeah.
As you said, we can just access it all times through a trillion different means and portals. So I think for us, the hard recommendation is just this like willpower of
Right.
discipline, right? Like you said,
Right.
like I'm just
Don't
gonna
do
show
it.
up to the buffet and I'm gonna bring up this size plate, right? And
Right.
I'm only gonna fill it with this, even though it
And that's
says
it.
all you can eat, right?
Right.
All you can eat, and everyone around me is loading it up with their snow crabs or whatever, right? And I'm just gonna get my one little salad, and like little roll or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of the advice is like that, and there's truth to that, right?
Yeah.
There's an element of truth about, well, now we live in a time when because we don't have these societal institutional boundaries, we will need intention, right?
Right.
Will need to actually decide, make a choice, right?
Right.
Because as the scholars put it, there are these technological affordances that have opened up, right? The technology has
Sure.
created opportunity that we just didn't have before, and now we have to choose,
Right.
right? It's
Right.
so
Right.
much easier to just go to the buffet and just keep loading up because everyone else is doing it and it's there. It's incredible. And we
Right.
just are like greedy, right? And there's questions about why are we greedy, for information and entertainment.
Sure.
That's another conversation.
Yeah.
Um, but I think part of what we need to do is not just the individual discipline, like I'm going to show up with my plate, but I think it's really important for us to, in many ways, begin building new institutions,
Okay.
actually,
Yeah.
right? And that can look like something as small as my group of friends, my household, my community, right? Whatever it is, where we all talk to each other about what do we think is a healthy way to approach this buffet?
Right.
And let's go together. Let's
Yeah.
go together and sit at the table and eat together with our decided amount, right? And we're still gonna have a good time. We're still gonna get our fill. But
Yeah.
let's just eat this because we know this is actually healthier than just going to the dessert station and eating pounds and pounds of tiramisu, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so let's do that together. So again, there's the informal institutions, so to speak, that are
Yeah.
communal and that help us. So it's not just like my willpower, right? But then there are other kinds of institutions where it might be the workplace, schools, right? Actually existing institutions that will help us and be like, hey, like now it's like there's states that are starting to tell their public schools, hey, now's a let's not let's have the teachers ask their students to put their phones away, right?
Right.
Like that's a good idea, right? And that this
Right.
is a recommended practice that we'd like our public schools to do. That's an
Yeah.
example, right, of an institutional constraint that's
Yeah.
saying let's limit the size of the plate, right?
Yeah.
Because this isn't healthy for what we're trying to do here, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that can happen in the workplace and other spaces as well.
Well, I think in addition to that, I really like the idea of building new institutions because I do think part of what we've lost, and the way I've thought about this is, we talk a lot about algorithms and how the algorithms are now feeding us content and they're deciding what we like based on the content that we've had before. And I'm like, but that's just a faster way of doing it than like we've had with the publishing industry this whole time. Publishers were that sort and filter for us at one level. They're deciding what the public is going to be interested in reading, and they're deciding what the best content is. They're vetting the information to some degree. They were functionally a very rudimentary algorithm for us. because we're trusting that institution to do this, and we're trusting them to sort through all of the proposals that are being made and decide what new information to present to us and how to do that and who's best to do that and all those kind of questions. And without those institutions, we are sort of now in a place where you can go online and search through 50 different websites and still have no particular idea which one is or isn't
Mhm.
helpful, right?
Mhm.
And so we've got that. And so I think there's a sense in which if we built back some of those institutions so that there is a more of a trust level and authority that we can look to and say, this person's done the work for us or this institution's done the work for us and we can trust it. It's not that they'll always be right. It's not that they won't, mess it up sometimes, but we can trust it. But then there's also this other side right now where I think, to your point about the willpower, we all sort of understand how not to overeat at a buffet, right? But I think there's a skill that's required in today's world that's sort of a new information literacy that most of us just don't have and probably don't even have the time to develop
Mhm.
when we're sorting and filtering all of this different information we're
Mhm.
getting.
Mhm.
Does that ring true?
Yeah, I think so. So the sorting and the filtering, I think, is an interesting, slightly different question, I guess, than the one I was thinking about. I was thinking about m merely amount of
Fair.
information that we're taking in.
Yeah.
Um, I think the sorting and the filtering is interesting because, back to your example about algorithms. So algorithms, I agree, there is definitely a similarity to prior institutions that were curating, and
Right.
perhaps not merely curating for the good, but curating for the sale, right?
Right.
And I think what's maybe slightly different about today's algorithms is that it does that, right? Its point is to try to keep us on whatever
Right.
platform, right? But what it's doing is it's not only responding to our clicks in real time, right? It's like taking our data and, like you said, kind of hyper speed responsiveness.
Right.
But what's interesting is how it's also nudging us. Um,
Mm,
it's nudging us in the direction of its advertisers, right?
sure.
And its sponsors. And so that's where I think it's interesting to think about the difference
Yeah.
between today's algorithms and the kind of prior profit-based
100%.
curating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, in terms of how we go about filtering our information, I mean, I think you're right. Like it's it's almost impossible to um, for most of us to kind of take a course on information literacy or
Right.
media literacy, right? And even the courses that they teach in high school, I have a high schooler right now, they're just like rolling their eyes. They're like, oh, geez, right?
Right.
But I think this is where, to me, there's skill set that I think, like, and there's lots of really great, I think, folks that are doing, you could go and listen to a 15-minute TED Talk on media literacy and come away with
Sure.
like best
A
tips,
lot. Yeah.
right? But I am actually going to be a little old school here and say, um, what we really need is, this is going to sound so old school for so many people, um, is like, we really need the humanities back, right? You, you
I
actually
wholeheartedly agree. Yeah.
you need to know history,
Yeah.
right? Like actually
Yeah.
and learn history from different sources
Yeah.
so that you have the developing of some kind of measure standard, right? From
Yeah.
which you could be like, you could hear something or read something and be like, really? Like, I
Yeah.
don't know if that actually connects with what I remember hearing about the history
Right.
of X, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, or having read some other seminal text, whether it's philosophical or theological or something. And I don't think you have to be a nerd to have exposure to this, right? Like you can get kind of like simplified, much more accessible, sources that anchor you in
Yeah.
some kind of reality where you're like, oh, people through the ages have thought this. And again, I think it's important to get a variety of sources, right? And so this is
Yeah.
where like moving beyond, say, like a Western Civ canon,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
sort of syllabus list is important because I think there's a lot of needs for whether it's like female writers or people of color writing about the same history, about the same experience, right? Is really important to kind of round out, right, some of these key ideas. But I just think, if it's just like, it's like any child who is going to watch the news, like my parents watch the world news every night during dinner,
Yeah.
and I would just sit there and watch, and I had no idea what anything was about, like I grew up in the 80s. There was a hostage crisis. I mean, there's all this stuff. And I just was
Right.
like, I had no
Okay.
idea. I had no
Yeah.
context,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just took away whatever I took away when I was a young kid.
Right.
But it's like, aren't we like that so much with what we see online now? Like,
Oh
we have no
yeah.
context
Yeah.
for putting that information into some existing kind of grid of like, I understand the world to kind of function this way,
Right.
right? Um, so how does this measure up or compare? How does this help my understanding grow or evolve, right? If it's countering it, well, maybe I can go and try to figure out what that's about. Like is the
Yeah.
thing I'm reading like actually um legit or is it sus, as the young people say, right? And I need to go and maybe rely on a different source, right? But I think it
Yeah.
also, to me, I mean, apart from that, I know that's a high call, right? To like send people to read, philosophical texts and start watching the History Channel or whatever. I think it actually requires um, like good or healthy self filtering and knowing how to measure
Yeah.
requires a degree of like self-awareness self-awareness of the kind of person you are. Am I someone that is prone to fear? Am I
Yeah.
someone that is prone to wanting to pick a fight?
Yeah.
um like we're all different people, we have different experiences,
Right.
but we need to know our vulnerabilities, right? When we
Yeah.
read information, right? So for me, like if I have some slight, like weird thing happening in my body or my health, right? I know enough about myself now to not go on Google and type in whatever the thing is, right? Because I
Right.
know I'm going to get on the website that tells me I'm going to die in 48 hours unless I go to the ER now, right?
Right.
I
Right.
have some like inexplicable disease that only 0.5% of the world has ever seen, right? I know that about myself.
Yeah.
I choose not to go onto Google or any website to look it up because I know that about myself, right?
Yeah.
Like I just get
Yeah. Yeah.
wound up. And so to me, I think what all of this media ecology is doing is not only making it very difficult for us to um, know what to choose or to be more moderated in our appetites, but it's also making it very difficult for us to be still enough to
Yeah.
know ourselves, right?
Yeah.
To like be self-aware and use that self-awareness as a modality to guide us to be like, I know I am prone this way, so I need to be cautious,
Yeah.
right? I know I am prone to conspiracies, right? So I need to be right. I know I'm prone to like going down, drilling into statistic after statistic, study after study, whatever, right? Like, so
Yeah.
I need to be careful, about this.
It's so when you were writing in Restless Devices, because I think this is really a unique emphasis in your book, is that you talk about that idea that you just expressed of not having the self-reflective time to sort of own ourselves. And I think your comment about the difference between what publishers used to do and what the algorithm does, it nudges us. It in some ways, it's sort of shaping us into products. I can't remember who wrote it. It's the gentleman. I think he wrote 10 Reasons to Delete Your Social Media Accounts Right Now, and I just can't remember his name.
Yeah.
But
Jaron Lanier. Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
there you go. And he talks about, if it's free, you're the product.
Yeah.
Like, these companies aren't doing this out of benevolence necessarily. It's they also are making money and they're making money off your attention. And so I think that idea of the restless devices are constantly, and maybe you wouldn't put it this way, but just sort of the way I'm trying to think my way through it, they're constantly nudging us to become something we're not and distracting us from really thinking through not only who we are individually at this moment in this present time, but also who we are as a society, as a culture, what our history is, all of those kind of things. And I think if we sort of look at the way you've articulated that, the humanities gives us that sense of what does it mean to be human across the ages? What have people really been thinking about? In the moment, if all I'm doing is looking at my glowing rectangle all the time, I don't have a lot of self-reflective moments in that. I'm just constantly taking in content from other people and maybe wishing I was them, wishing my life was different, wishing it, whatever that is. And so you have this sort of ubiquitous, ever-present device that is now shoving content at you potentially 24/7, unless you sleep in there somewhere. Um, that really is disrupting our thought process in some pretty significant ways.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that you know, um, even the simplest things like getting a good night's sleep
Yeah,
and going outside if you're in a place that's warm enough to go outside right now, um, going outside, being in nature in some way without taking pictures of it,
yeah,
that those simple things are becoming challenges to us now,
yeah,
but they're so important in rooting us, the beginning of the rooting, right? That
yeah,
that helps us to have kind of steady thoughts, enough of a sense of what's going on inside. Am I feeling anxious? Am I um, um, feeling restless about something? Am I bored in a deep existential way? Whatever,
yeah,
But
yeah,
it's like I mean, that's where I think back to we could call it discipline or boundaries or rhythms or practices, right?
yeah,
That's where setting up some practices and in other, if we spin it through different other kinds of conversations, this is called self-care, right? Like getting a
right,
good night's sleep, actually, exercising, right?
yeah,
Being outside, right? Whatever, orbit of conversation makes sense to you. I think these are all God-given ways of grounding us, right? Like sleep. I was thinking about how sleep is truly an incredible thing. I mean, it's
yeah,
kind of it feels superfluous, right? It's sort of like, why were we created to sleep? What an
right,
interesting thing, right?
yeah, yeah,
And yet so like in one sense it feels incredibly vulnerable, right? Because you're like you don't know what's happening while you're sleeping. right? But in another sense, it's so tender and sweet, when you see a child or a baby sleeping, it's just,
Yeah.
and in the context of someone who may be operating with a faith, right? There's this sense of, oh, you can sleep in peace because there is a God who is doing the work in the world, who is
Yeah.
taking care of you, who is providing. That is why you don't have to stay up working or
Yeah.
fretting or tending the fire or guarding your house, right? And so I think these very basic elements of being human that we just kind of like pass over, like, oh yes,
Yeah.
like, yeah, or we resist, like, oh, why do I, like if only if I could just operate with 4 hours of sleep, that would be so much better, right?
Right.
It's
Be
like,
so
no,
much
no,
more
no, no, no.
productive. Right.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. It's like, no, no, no. Like that's actually like really wonderful part of life, right? Like being
Yeah.
able to sleep a full night and being able to go outside with not listening to anything, not taking pictures or anything, and just like looking at the trees, looking at the grass, right? There's something that is
Yeah.
feeding us through God's creation. And I think we underestimate very often the power of those
Hmm.
very essential parts of our daily lives.
You and I seem like we probably grew up around in the same era, right? So we bridged between the analog, we could call it,
Mhm.
right, world and the digital world. And increasingly, as I think about this, I see that as a real advantage
Mhm.
because I understand how to do things without my phone.
Mhm.
And I'm actually kind of comfortable doing things without my phone. I mean, there's something uh, especially unique about pulling up a streaming service on your television and feeling nostalgic about the four stations that you used to have, and um, I can still remember that sort of the smell of the first VCR. Like when you took it out of the box, it had a certain scent to it, and you're like, oh wow, this is awesome, right? Now I get to tape stuff on this antiquated videotape, but I think it's an advantage. And so one of the things that I worry about is, for folks like us who have had that experience and can sort of understand how to recalibrate to a world where the technology just was never an option for us anyway. We could set it aside, right? And sometimes I do find the technology just gets in my way. It's annoying. Safety features on cars drive me crazy. It's like I
Right.
could have sworn I knew how to drive until this car decided that it knows better than me.
Right.
But neither here nor there. But my concern, I guess, is for the generation that's grown up wholly digital, where this stuff has just been sort of part of their warp and woof their entire life. How do they understand how to rest? How do they
Mm.
even understand how to be in nature without taking a selfie stick with them, without, filming a video to put it on Instagram?
Yeah.
Like, do they understand that, or is that something that we're starting to lose as a society?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think, having taught college students for almost 20 years and having this conversation about the internet for over 20 years, it's been really interesting seeing students change. So
Yeah.
I was getting the same bracket, the 18 to 21, year
Right,
after year
right.
after year. And it was interesting, I would say in the last 5 years, I started seeing a shift, right? Up until
Sure.
then, it was always the young people were much more um, excited, much more defensive about the wonders of technology and it's good. And I'd say over the last 5 years, there's been this shift to students being much more curious and interested about possibly learning something that explains this dissatisfaction and
Hmm.
frenzy that they feel inside of their own experience, right?
Yeah.
And their willingness to try a fast or to try some other practice that I might suggest or assign to them. And not groan, but be like, oh, that sounds terrible, but I'll try it. It might
Yeah.
be helpful. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'm really curious about actually the Gen Z and like I'm
Yeah.
wondering if they're starting to, because they're growing up with it so young,
Yeah.
that they're feeling the wear of it.
Quicker
And
than
it's
maybe we would even.
converse right. And the
Yeah.
conversation culturally is already, Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation, right?
Right.
There's the cultural conversation is shifting.
Yeah.
Um, but like in terms of like how do young people and new generations learn that being in nature is an incredible thing? I think, the example I always have or I think about is the overnight camps that still exist for kids
Sure. Yeah.
and how these overnight camps, for the most part, take their phones away, right? They're like,
Yeah.
no phones. And the kids groan and they belly ache for it for the first 24 hours, and then they start having fun.
Yeah.
They love it, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, they get back in the minivan at the end of the camp and then they get their phones back and they're back.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
That's the reality for now. But they remember how cool it was when
Yeah.
they were 6 days just with these other kids doing
Yeah.
something, without their technology. And I'm really of the minds, I think this is where, I'm generally a pessimistic person.
Yeah.
But this is where I hold on to a string of hope, which is that when we taste something good, we recognize it. We just do, you
Yeah.
know, and we hold on to that. And, it might take us a while to get through all the distraction and all the kind of things that we might even put in our own way, but we will seek it out
Yeah.
eventually. And so I think the key here is if the kind of natural experiences that you and I grew up with, the analog world, right,
Right.
won't come easily for the newer generations. We have to find ways to give it to them. Like we need intention, right? If they're not
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
running out the door after school and playing in the woods until mom calls and says it's dinner time, then we
Right.
need to create times for them. And I think my main concern, thinking about, from a sociological perspective, is that those opportunities usually are easier for upper middle class kids, right?
Sure.
It's a class thing, right? So, like, the more you
Yeah.
move
Yeah.
down the economic scale, you actually find that lower, poorer populations are going to be the ones that are stuck within the digital cage,
Yeah.
right? There is no outdoors for them to go to. There
Right.
is
Right.
no, restful sleep for them to have.
Yeah.
Um, and they're the ones that are going to be trapped in what technology has to offer. And I
Right.
think that's something that as a society, as the church, right, that we need to be really keeping an eye on and thinking about how do we contribute, be a helpful presence in making
Yeah.
sure that all kids growing up, right, have these moments, these opportunities to breathe fresh air, run wild, in the
Yeah.
woods, be at a stream and realize like, this is incredible, right? This
Yeah.
is so cool. Just doing this with other kids.
That's an interesting insight. I mean, again, sort of going back to my childhood, I show my daughter sometimes these PSAs that we would have seen growing up. And one of them is, yeah, I think it's like, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? And they're
Yes.
looking at me like, they're like, what is this? This is a joke? And I'm like, no, it's not a joke. Like, it was a literal problem. Like, we didn't have any way, like, parents didn't have any way to know where their kids were. So, you assume they're safe, I guess. You don't, you go over to the neighbor's house and you ask, but they're not. Like, what recourse do you really have? You're not going to call the cops, every night. So yeah, if it gets around 10 o'clock and your kid's not home, you should start worrying. But that had to be sort of messaged, and
Yeah, right.
I think back on that, and I realize I'm not naive about the dangers that would have been around in our, when I was a
Right.
kid. Like, not naive about those, but at the same time, I look out at what we're facing now, and you sit back and you go, is it to the are we at a place societally where, Jonathan, you brought up Jonathan Haidt's, or referenced Jonathan Haidt's book, the sort of free range parenting that he advocates for is actually more dangerous than it was back in our day. Because, going back to something you mentioned, the institutional changes are such that it's just easier nowadays to coordinate, to travel, to, you know, all of these different things that you think about, like, in any given scenario, it's not only easier for us to do things, it's easier for bad actors to do things.
Mhm.
And so I think that it's really important. I agree with you 100%. We've got to find ways to get kids out into their environment. But I also think, to one of your earlier points, there have to be these institutional changes
Mhm. Mhm.
where it's okay now to let my kid go out and do X, Y, or Z because they're going to be relatively safe. And, them putting their phone aside is not going to put them at a massive disadvantage to a bad actor who could use that digital technology to do something horrible to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
It's almost,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah, totally. And that's where I think again, schools and churches,
yeah,
if if we live in a society that has so fundamentally shifted in the makeup of our neighborhoods, in the
yeah,
makeup of like who is around and do we even know our neighbors, right?
right,
Right. These are fundamentally shifted. Then what are the alternatives, right? I mentioned the camp earlier. There are camps that help kids that are growing up in urban settings that have never seen a patch of grass, right?
right,
You have camps that actually bring those kids out to a forest, to a farm, right?
yeah,
And it's fully scholarshiped, it's fully, right?
yeah,
And it's like, hey, let's do something for a week or 3 days. Or you have people that are the urban farmers, right? That are
yeah, yeah,
reclaiming abandoned parking lots and saying, let's build something beautiful here and let's make
yeah,
it ours, right? Not just someone else coming in to do it, but I'm going to teach you how to plant this and this is going to be yours, right? That you can raise up and be proud of, right? And so I think there are these creative, right, options that we can kind of sprout up amidst
yeah,
the kind of harder long range shifts in these institutions, as you said, right? Like we
yeah,
need to be much more innovative about bringing the nature in, right? Or finding ways to um, be the one who initiates the block party, right, in the HOA or the neighborhood, right, to actually
yeah,
find out who's living 5 doors down from me, right?
yeah,
Like these are things that used to just happen, right? Like you just knew, but now we again need intention, right? You need
yeah,
intention, whether it's programming or being the one who initiate something. But I think what we'll find is that people actually really appreciate it, right? Like,
yeah,
like I just read somewhere, I forget where I was reading this about the person who did the chili cook-off block party in their neighborhood because they didn't know their neighbors. And
yeah,
they were really anxious. They put out flyers and RSVP, and like no one RSVP'd. Like one person RSVP'd. They're like, oh, geez, now like we're just like the weird people on the street. But they still set it up and everything. But people came. They
yeah,
they came. And that's where I go back to this kind of hope and conviction that like God created us in a certain way that longs for relation, longs for presence
yeah,
with each other, right, in the same place, and that we just have to keep knocking on that door, right?
yeah,
And people want to come in the end of the day. And so we just have to be sprouting those opportunities and thinking about innovative ways to build within the structures that we have, right? That that create these opportunities of engaging each other, engaging nature, and also creating some equity, right, and access to
Yeah.
these opportunities.
I think that's great. I love the idea of it because it just suggests that we've been really innovative technologically, and what we
Mhm.
need to do now is be as aggressively innovative about recovering, as your subtitle of your book is, recovering personhood, presence, and place. We've got to be equally as aggressively innovative about doing those kind of things. We can't just let these things go as if, and just lament that they're gone. We have to kind of fight to keep them around because otherwise, the digital age, it does have a tendency to squeeze these things out. And,
Mhm.
we assume that we can get along without it until we realize that we just can't. And I love your insight about the undergraduate students, the idea that they're feeling this in a different way than maybe we would, and recognizing the wear and the tear because they've just been so inundated with it, the emptiness of it all, that this isn't the sort of diet you can sustain, right? Sort of like just eating candy, right? Eventually that's not going to feel great. And so you
Yeah.
start to discover, oh, I need something else. And so it's not
Mhm.
that and I don't hear you saying this, let's not get rid of it all,
Mhm.
but let's carve out these spaces. Let's make sure that we don't lose what was good about something that was pre-digital
Mhm.
just because we're in the digital.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
and I mean the whole key for me is that we have to be grounded or dialed
yeah,
in,
yeah,
right, to know, back to your kind of earlier question, how to filter, right? Like how to
yeah,
choose. And if we're not grounded and dialed in, calibrated in a way that feels like we are living in a way that is aligned with our priorities, our commitments, right? That dialing in is or that choosing, right?
yeah,
What from that humongous buffet is just constantly going to be misguided or just confused, right?
right,
Constantly. So we have to work on figuring out this first, right? Like
right,
ourselves. We have to have a sense of our own self, do the things that ground us, right? If you're a person of faith, then maybe that looks like committing yourself to seeking out God's light
yeah,
and vision of oneself, right? Because
yeah,
we are limited in our own capacity to know ourselves,
yeah,
right? Or finding people that are trustworthy that can speak into our lives in ways that are generative and helpful to us. And so then we can start making some hopefully good choices.
yeah. Well, Felicia, we're sort of at the end of time. I actually went a little over time because I was just sorry, I was interested in the topic, but
That's
um,
fine.
I really appreciate you being here, and this has been a fantastic conversation. I'd really recommend folks, if you're listening, Restless Devices: Recovering Personhood, Presence, and Place in the Digital Age. Great book, great insights, and I just really thank you, Felicia, for your emphasis on that sociological emphasis just draws so much out of this conversation, I think, and I just so appreciate it. Even just the idea of, that idea of giving people access to these places, thinking through that some people just won't have access unless we give it to them, I think is really one of the big things that I'm taking away that I hadn't really thought about. And so very much appreciate that emphasis and just thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, so great to be with you, James. This has been fabulous.
And folks, we'll put the link to the book. We'll put the link to Felicia's website in the show notes. And don't forget, this is an IVP book, and they've given me a 20% discount code. So order off their website with that code, and you'll get 20% off. So thanks everybody for listening. Thanks everybody for being here, and we will see you on the next episode of Thinking Christian. Take care.
Just want to take a second to thank the team at Life Audio for their partnership with us on the Thinking Christian podcast. If you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. They've got shows about prayer, Bible study, parenting, and more.
Looking for inspiration and uplifting stories of faith? Welcome to the Jesus Calling Stories of Faith podcast, now available on Life Audio. Join us each week for heartfelt conversations and personal stories from people from all walks of life that will inspire you and lift your spirit. Whether you're seeking comfort, motivation, or just a moment of peace. The Jesus Calling Stories of Faith podcast offers a beautiful reminder of faith and hope. Listen to the Jesus Calling Stories of Faith podcast on lifeaudio.com or wherever you find your podcasts.